You're listening to Mary Jane from the DWNews podcast. We're doing a read-through of the published book Cannabis in South Africa, The People's Plant. It's a full-spectrum manifesto for policy reform. It's the third edit and a discussion document for public comment. This read-through is for the purpose of giving all South Africans the opportunity to be informed and to shape the policies that our government might make. We're on page 9. You can go back to previous recordings where I've got some definitions and the foreword by the Dacha couple. We're on page 9 and this is section 1, the background, history and context of cannabis in South Africa. Firstly, 1.1, the introduction. Let us make it clear right from the beginning, cannabis will not be legal in South Africa until the South African Police Reserve is fully informed of their role within the new regulatory framework. And that role is restricted to those offences relating to cannabis which cause harm or violate the rights of another citizen. Cannabis prisoners whose convictions no longer carry weight under the Constitution are to be set free with no conditions. Cannabis cannot be considered de jure legal in South Africa unless each and every adult citizen can have access to the legal cannabis economy, should they wish to, and be able to comply with legislation and regulations without fear nor favour. Since the Constitutional Court judgment on 18th September 2018, every citizen has the right to grow their own cannabis in private spaces for their own consumption in private spaces. Every citizen must be able to function within much broader regulations, without favour being granted to those who have the capital or infrastructure in place already, or at their disposal. We are well aware that opportunities that arise from legal regulation are wide open to corruption, and this has been a major force that has shaped this document. In order that both the legal and economic rights of all citizens are protected, it is essential that lawmakers engage in the public during the establishment of a framework for cannabis legislation. This is essential because South Africa is an existing cannabis economy, one that is centuries old, and although it is unregulated, it functions very efficiently and contributes vast sums to the economy in an informal way. This is why we are insisting that cannabis users, cultivators and traders are consulted throughout the process of drafting legislation. Nothing about us without us. 1.2 History. There's a quote here by Abba Eban, an Israeli politician in 1970. He's quoted to say here, "History teaches us that men and nations behave wisely once they have exhausted all other alternatives." There are images and diagrams in this edition of the Cannabis in South Africa, The People's Plant. I encourage you all to please get a copy of your own from the Fields of Green for All website to have a look at those images. I'll continue. After hundreds of years of use on the mountains and in the valleys and settlements of southern Africa, South Africa has the dubious reputation of being the first country where one population group imposed the prohibition of cannabis on another population group. The British Army settlers of the late 19th century disliked their Hindu labourers, using bhang as a sacrament in the sugarcane fields of their Natal colony. Colonial observations included it renders the Indian immigrant unfit and unable to perform with satisfaction to the employer, the work for which he was specifically brought to this colony. Unquote. The year was 1870. By the time the Medical and Pharmacy Act had been passed in 1891, cannabis indica, or Indian hemp, has been classified as poison, and when the Union of South Africa was established in 1910, a ban on the sale and consumption of Indian hemp, or daga, for all population groups was promulgated nationally. A decade later, at the same time, South Africa was passing the Customs and Excise Duties Act No. 27 of 1924, ratifying the national ban on daga. In Vienna, the League of Nations were constructing laws to ban the use and sale of opium. a timely letter from South African government concerning Indian hemp, and an impassioned plea by the King of Egypt concerning hashish brought cannabis sativa into the League's spotlight. This intertwining of opium and hemp legislation, and just now how timely President Jan Smuts' letter to the League of Nations was on behalf of the British, was no coincidence. Smuts' message was a political tactic, a bargaining chip at the opium table for the British, and a pivotal point for the international drug policy, South Africa and the cannabis plant. South Africa's intervention on the international drug policy stage resulted in the global prohibition of cannabis. Successive South African governments in the 1940s and 1950s undertook an obsessive amount of research concerning dagga. This culminated in the 1952 report of the Interdepartmental Committee on the Abuse of Dagga, RIDCAD, a groundbreaking publication in its day, but was starved of science, but recommended a more scientific approach, and had little or nothing to say about dagga or the population groups that use it. It was obvious from the tone of the RIDCAD, South Africa would become a signatory to the United Nations Single Convention on Drugs in 1961. This document is still the apex of the world drug policy and has changed little in 50 years. This is a favourite treaty for successive South African governments to hide behind as their obligation to international drug policy whenever reform at home has been called for. When the United Nations ratified the 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Drugs, signed by South Africa, US President Richard Nixon was instigating his all-out war on drugs. South Africa, as if on cue, passed the Draconian Abuse on Dependence-Producing Substances and Rehabilitation Centres Act of 1971. Over 77,000 citizens, the overwhelming majority being black males, were incarcerated in the first 2 years of the Act. This was the most punitive piece of apartheid legislation to have been passed in at the time, not only criminalizing users, but also farmers and traders with minimum mandatory sentencing and the presumption of guilt before innocence. In the mid-1980s, the UN passed more drug war resolutions, promulgating the even tougher stance with increased sentencing and incarceration measures. As a result, the Drugs and Drug Trafficking Act of 1992 came about as an amendment to the 1971 Act and is the current law dealing with illicit drugs, including dagga, in South Africa. The same law that was found to be unconstitutional by the Constitutional Court in September 2018. While we were preparing for the trial of the plant, which got underway in the Pretoria High Court in July 2017, there were a number of times we had to defend our wish to have a history expert testify in court. Knowing the history of the cannabis plant in South Africa and the history of the prohibition of the plant, both here and subsequently worldwide, we believe that this is an essential foundation for the way forward. During our campaign, we have often referred to the 1992 Drugs Act as the last apartheid law. We see it as a cut-and-paste progression encompassing 150 years of laws and punishments with roots in colonial racism and moral judgment, not scientific evidence. We wish to remind the lawmakers of this. We challenge the parliamentarians in charge of this process to accept our offer to start the proceedings with a presentation on the history of cannabis in South Africa. We suggest beginning with a look at the word dagga itself, how steeped in historical prejudices and politically loaded it has become. Dagga is the nation's tokolosh. The word dagga, an aberrance to some, is still being brought up in regular emails to us by South Africans who really despise this 5-letter word. The word is thousands of years older than the prohibition of the plant and is now extinct qui linguistic description of intoxication, not cannabis. The repeal of this law and the rewriting of the offending legislation will give the South African government an opportunity to apologize for continuing to enact an unjust and irrational colonial law on its citizens since the fall of apartheid in 1994. Our government has perpetuated a colonial legacy with the arrest and detention of hundreds of thousands of citizens under their watch, some of whom remain behind bars to this day. Cannabis must no longer be a criminal offence. The international drug treaties can no longer be used as an excuse for inaction. Countries such as Uruguay and Canada have fully legalized all uses of the plant, and over half of the USA states now have medical and or adult use laws in place. We are extremely grateful for our history expert, Craig Patterson. He has a PhD. His 2009 thesis was the foundation of our historical evidence in court. Dr. Patterson, an expert witness on the trial of the plant, entered his history testimony into the record and was recorded on the Pretoria High Court live stream. I think we should take a break as my recording to Spreaker is probably going to reach its 15-minute mark soon. Not enough to finish the current section. So thank you for listening. Please remember to share, especially with anybody who is shy of the cannabis conversation. I appeal to parliamentarians and lawmakers to consider the evidence and the facts. Where you might not be able to read this manifesto, I give this to all those who can, can't, won't, or haven't got the manifesto to read, to listen to this when you have a podcast moment, whether you're washing dishes or out in the garden staring at the view. You're listening to Mary Jane, and this is the Manifesto Read Through, as promised on the last DWNews episode. You can find it on Spreaker or wherever you get your favorite podcasts from. And remember, if you tell people to listen, they'll want to listen much more than if they just see it on their feed. So give us a listen. Thank you.